Hello and welcome back to Pictorial on Relay FM. I'm Quinn Rose and I didn't go to art school, but that doesn't stop me from learning about art anyway.
And I'm Betty. I also didn't go to art school, but I also love learning about art all the time anyway as well.
On this podcast, we generally talk about visual artists, mostly like painters and sculptors. That's kind of our thing. We're not doing that today. Today is our 50th episode and is also serving as our 2-year anniversary, which is very exciting. We did it. Woo. So I decided just to have a little bit of fun in my home arena, which is talking about musicals.
I'm very excited about this. I had a lot of fun last time, and I learned a lot because I pretty much don't know anything about musicals, so it's a fun experience for me.
Well, today I am basically just going to walk through a few different musicals that are about visual artists. There's a lot of fun stuff to talk about here, and I also picked up on some pretty interesting patterns, which I think will make some fun discussion topics for the second half of the episode here. But first, I thought I'd just dive into some examples. I do want to mention, I guess I'll consider these honorary mentions.
Okay.
Of a couple different ones that I'm not really going to get into. First of all, there's Fun Home, which is based on a graphic novel. It is also based on the life of the graphic novelist and cartoonist Alison Bechdel. And so that's definitely very much related to visual art. A lot of the musical is about her early experiences with drawing and learning illustration. There's also Ordinary Days, which is a musical that is not about any real artist or even any named artist, but it's kind of the concept of art is very prominent throughout the musical. There's multiple scenes at the Met. They talk a lot about what art is and how you can appreciate art. And one of the main plot lines is about a man who is working for this like contemporary artist in New York, but his contemporary art is graffiti and he's bad at it.
Okay.
And he goes to jail. And so this
God.
guy is like hired to feed his cat while he's gone. And that kind of sparks a lot of these conversations about art and who is an artist and all this kind of stuff.
I just Googled the Ordinary Days, and I'm seeing a lot of pictures of like random pieces of colored paper all over the place. Is that a thing?
Yeah. So part of this is this artist, what he did was he would basically like write these as they put it in the song, like write these messages all over the city that are like, they're kind of encouraging cliches. And this guy this is the very first song. I really like Ordinary Days. I could talk about it for a while. But one of our main characters, the very beginning of the musical, the opening song, he's standing on a sidewalk with all of these papers where he's decided he's going to like take up the mantle of this artist. But instead of, painting these messages, he's printed them out on all these papers, written them on all these papers, and he's trying to pass them out to people and trying to like share these like happy messages with people, which is not easy to do in Manhattan. Yeah, so those are just kind of a couple of honorable mentions that aren't quite what I'm mostly talking about today. Also, I guess I'll mention Moulin Rouge does feature a real artist whose name was Henry Toulouse as a very minor character. And also like in real life, he was a painter and a printmaker, very much a visual artist. And they portray him as more of a musical artist in Moulin Rouge. Moulin Rouge is very fantastical and not interested in portraying reality, so that makes sense. But they do use the name of a real artist, which is interesting.
I actually didn't Henry design also the posters for Moulin Rouge as well?
He did, yes. That's one of the things he's most famous for.
Oh, okay. I was like, I thought I've heard this somewhere, but anyway.
So my first big section I want to talk about, though, is what I am calling musicals about Van Gogh, which apparently is its own genre.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In looking at musicals that are about like real famous artists, I found 5, and 3 of them are about Van Gogh.
Oh my.
I'm sure there are more, but this is like the ones that I found that could be like discerned through Google, and who have like gotten enough sort of public attention that they showed up in my search. But yeah, I understand that like Van Gogh is one of the most famous artists in the world. And also like I think his life story is very engaging to people because he had such a tragic life that people are very much relate to a lot of things about him and are very drawn to him. But yeah, it does seem like there's this outsized musical interest in Van Gogh.
3 full musicals, even just, of note. That's quite a few.
What's really interesting about them, too, is they all take very different tacks and they all focus on very different areas of his life, which is pretty cool to see. Like, they're not all just like, oh, here's the story of Van Gogh. Like, they're all very specific chapters in his life or like angles in his life, which is fascinating to me. One's called The Highest Yellow, which premiered in 2004. And this focuses on Van Gogh's relationship with the physician who treated him after he cut his ear off. And so this is a real physician. Obviously, I haven't seen the show, obviously, but I would assume aspects of this are fictionalized or sensationalized. But this was a real person, and they had a real relationship and an exchange. Van Gogh painted this man. The doctor did not like the portrait that Van Gogh painted of him. It seemed like they had kind of a tumultuous relationship at different points. But that is what The Highest Yellow is about. The highest yellow being a reference to Van Gogh's interest in the color yellow. Then there's Curtains Up, which is actually about the brief period when Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin lived together, and both were inspired by the innkeeper's wife, and both painted her in different paintings that they produced. This is, again, real period of Van Gogh's life in which he lived with this other artist who he was quite close to, but this focusing again on this particular chapter and their relationship with this woman. And then finally, there's this other musical that I found called Starry, which is actually still in active development. It was only started to be developed in like 2017, I think, and it's still, there's like a concept album out, but it's still like being developed, which is pretty interesting. And this focuses on the relationship between Van Gogh and his brother Theo, who he was extremely close to and had a very close letter correspondence with. A lot of their letters are actually like some of the most rich autobiographical material that we have on Van Gogh because they were so detailed. And Theo supported Vincent basically his entire life and allowed him to survive at it because he was not financially successful as an artist in his time. And so this musical focuses like on their relationship throughout their lives.
Yeah, it does seem like these are all periods that are pretty significant and kind of can be their own self-contained stories. So I can see why like someone would want to explore those aspects of his life. Do they kind of also refer to like the artworks that he made in I presume they probably do.
Yeah. One thread that I found when researching all these musicals is it definitely seems to open up a lot of possibilities for staging that are really exciting because I think especially with these ones about Van Gogh, obviously, I mean, even the names of them, The Highest Yellow, Starry, like they're clearly invoking the visual aspect of their work. And I think that there is a strong draw and even a pressure to depict Van Gogh's work in the staging visually in a way that captures the magic of, like seeing those works that so many people have appreciated.
Yeah, this reminds me of, last year I went to see the Van Gogh Immersive Experience show. And it was in Toronto, at the time. And this is, for those who don't know, it's a show where images from his paintings projected like in 3 dimensions all over the place in this big room. And it's edited and animated, and there's music playing in the background. Like it, as the name suggests, it's supposed to be an immersive experience. And it was actually like I did really enjoy it. But one thing that I did notice is that a lot of Van Gogh's paintings are just really amazing, beautiful backdrops for settings and places. Like they just seem like they would just be beautiful like stage sets. In a ways, like I can see how Van Gogh's like art can kind of easily translate into like a stage type of setting in a way.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on why Van Gogh in particular is so beloved as a subject. I mean, I said some of mine earlier where I think like the tragedy of his life is appealing. But do you think besides like that people are drawn to his art, do you think there's any other reason that you can think of why he is so well represented in this kind of area?
That's a really good question. And I think one aspect is probably just that his art, it does seem to be, I want to say like universally appreciated, or at least like as far as I know, the visuals that he made and the colors and the richness. And yeah, like I think a lot of people are drawn to it. I think just it as an artist, it seems like he's very unique and just appreciated a lot more than other artists who some people may like them and some people may not. And yeah, like I think that maybe the other reason is because he's a bit of like a mysterious or type of person, because he wasn't well known at all during his lifetime and was only really became famous after he died. So there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of questions about like his life. And I think people like to explore that, or people like to learn about, you know, like what it's like to be an artist, to have painted all his life but never really got famous, like, or became well known or successful in his lifetime. So I think there's that mystery that people are interested in.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's so much space there to project, and I don't mean project in a negative way, but like project your own experiences and your own emotional journeys onto him, because there is so much mystery to fill in the gaps there with your own feelings. And shout out to everyone who has listened to this whole section thinking about that one scene in Doctor Who. I too have been thinking about that scene.
I have not seen that show, so I have no idea.
For anyone who hasn't seen it, there's a very, very beautiful episode of Doctor Who where they beat Vincent van Gogh, and then they take him to the future to see a Vincent van Gogh exhibit and hear a docent there speak about how Van Gogh is one of the finest artists who ever lived. And it's like, I can't even talk about it without crying because it's so beautiful.
Now that I think of it, I've heard of this. Even though I've never seen an episode of Doctor Who, I've heard about this before.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Even if you don't like Doctor Who, that's fair. I recommend this episode. If you like this podcast, you would probably enjoy this Van Gogh episode. It's a lot of fun. And it'll make you cry.
I think I might go watch it after this.
I do have a couple to talk about that aren't just about Van Gogh, though.
Okay.
I do want to briefly mention the play Red. It is a play and not a musical, which means I have very little interest in it. But it is one of the most sort of mainstream successful theatrical productions about a visual artist. This is a play about Mark Rothko, and specifically in the time period of 1958-59, when he was commissioned to paint murals for the Four Seasons restaurant, which he then famously didn't give to them and decided that he would not, he decided to return the money and not put these murals in the Four Seasons because he decided it was inappropriate for them. So this is a play that takes place during that period while he's painting them with this, what I believe, invented person, Ken, who's his assistant and kind of, you know, serves as the other person in this play. So it's not just a guy painting.
Wait, so there's only two people in this play?
Yeah, I think there is. And it was on, it was produced in 2009, and Eddie Redmayne was Ken. So there you go.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's one of the shows I'm talking about today that actually was on Broadway. Eddie Redmayne actually won the Tony for Best Featured Actor for it in 2010. So there you go. Got some success there.
Yeah, I think actually a couple episodes ago I talked about. Oh, wait, did I mention Eddie Redmayne in that episode? I can't remember.
You did. You did bring up Eddie Redmayne.
It was in my notes, but I forgot if I said it in the episodes. But yeah, this reminds me, like Eddie Redmayne, I talked about him a couple of episodes ago when we talked about the International Klein Blue, and he wrote a thesis on that vivid blue color. And I guess I just now found out he was in a play all about red. So he's really into colors.
The other one I want to quickly mention before I get into my little finale here is a musical about Keith Haring that was called Radiant Baby. I found this score described as rock punk disco, which makes a lot of sense. And I found a review of it that basically said the staging was incredibly cool and the show itself wasn't that good.
Oh, okay.
Which is sad. But there are a couple interesting things about this, including that the chorus of the show was children as a choice to reflect like Haring's work with children and depicting children frequently in his work, which I thought was very interesting. But this is more of a straightforward story about Keith Haring's life, especially like later in his life as he is a successful artist, but also struggling with AIDS and the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, I see from some of the pictures that it seems like Keith Haring, like, you know, that style and his baby imagery was used in the show. And I can see that also being like a very appealing, like, visual and backdrop. So, you know, it very interesting to see the what it looked like. But I guess since the actual show wasn't very good, that's kind of a letdown, but still.
I gotta say, the combination of things that I've heard about this show, in that it's got a rock punk disco score, and that it's about Keith Haring, has really good visuals, but isn't ultimately very good. This sounds like something I would personally really enjoy. And I wish I could go see it. I don't think anyone's putting on Radiant Baby. But there is music for it online, so go nuts, everybody.
I'm kind of interested in like hearing what the music in some of these plays that you mentioned are, because when I went to that experience, the immersive Van Gogh experience, like it was just interesting to hear like what type of music is being paired with the paintings and the visuals you see. Different art, like it evokes like different, you know, feelings for you. And so I'm very interested to kind of see what the interpretation that, you know, the people who did the musical scores for these plays, you know, ended up coming up with.
I feel like it's so important to have the music both reflect that art, but also work well with the art in order to, you know, to not only straightforwardly represent the feelings that the art evokes in you in a musical sense, but also like tie it into an overarching story that you're trying to tell. That can be quite challenging.
I think I just found I know this episode isn't about playbills. We talked about that already, but I think I found the playbill for Radiant Baby, and I would say it's not a great playbill either. Like it is very different and very unique, but it does seem like it's very kind of bland and like kind of different from what we talked about when we talked about playbills, where it's like usually it's very eye-catching and like iconic, and Keith Haring works are like really colorful and like, you know, really bold, and this is kind of the opposite of that.
Yeah, what an interesting choice. Well, the last one I want to talk about is one that we talked about on the Playbill episode as well, and that is, of course, Sunday in the Park with George. This is, I would say, undoubtedly the most famous musical that's been made thus far about a painter. It premiered in 1984, and it won tons of awards, including the Pulitzer Prize. So it's just very successful. But what's very interesting about this is, unlike pretty much every other musical on this list, it makes no attempt to represent the real life of the artist.
Oh, okay.
So this is a musical that was inspired by the painting A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte, which is that very famous giant painting that's made of all just dots of color rather than strokes of color. And so this was painted by George Seurat, and Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine went to the Art Institute of Chicago and looked at the painting, and they said, wow, I'm really inspired to make a musical based on that painting. And the main character is named George Seurat, but like it has it's not an attempt to actually represent his life. Like basically the rest of the characters are fictional. The story behind the painting in the musical is fictional. Like they make no secret of this. And the second half of the musical isn't even about George Seurat. It's about his fictional descendant, who is also an artist and is kind of battling with his legacy and the concept of art and what it means in the modern world. And it's a really good musical. It's actually the only one on the list that I've seen. I haven't seen it live because my life's sad. But there's a really good professional recording of it with the original cast that you can see, which is awesome. So I've seen that, and it's a really beautiful show. And it is like absolutely very much about this painting. They recreate the painting with actors in a way that is just a stunning piece of stagecraft, and lots of really cool stuff and lots of really interesting ideas about art through the lens of this visual artist who is obsessed with making this painting, but none of it is a representation of a real person.
Well, I mean, it's a play can be, or a musical can just be a work of fiction too. So
yeah. I just find it interesting that it is the most successful out of all of these. And it's also the only one that's like, we're not really concerned with biography. It's interesting because I think that of every musical that I've mentioned here today, I think the other one that I would consider like fairly well successful is Fun Home, which was in my honorable mentions, which is the true story of a person, of a real person, but takes a very non-traditional tact at portraying that life. It takes place at 3 different ages, and they're all interspersed with each other, and it's non-linear. And I wonder if there's something to that in that, like, attempts at more linear storytelling of these little sections of these real people's lives just like hasn't lent itself well to being on the stage.
I think what I really like about these plays, and or just like the existence of them, is that I think quite often we talk about art and like our experiences with them, and like, what art is for and what art does. And like something that I think I've mentioned a bunch of times, and probably we've talked about it too, is a lot of it is about like the painting or sculpture or whatever artworks, how they're experienced by people, by other people, like how the audience experiences them and how the audience interprets them over time, and how you can look at something that's really old and in history and have a connection with it. And I think these plays, like even I think especially the ones that you just mentioned that are people using these artworks as inspirations to create other stories. Like it shows you that these artworks, like there's a life beyond them, that that it's more than just somebody coming in and looking at a painting as like, oh, very nice, and like leaves. Is that they actually inspire other art and other types of creations.
That's a really nice way to think about it. I have 2 questions that I wanted to end this with. And one is kind of a open-ended philosophical question to start with, which is, why are all these about white men? And this is not counting Fun Home, which again is in the honorable mention. It doesn't technically count, but we've got Van Gogh, Mark Rothko, Keith Haring, George Seurat, even the other ones like Gogh, like Andy Warhol's in the Keith Haring one as well. Like every single one of these artists is a white man. And I'm just like, I'll cede the floor to you. What are your initial thoughts about this?
Well, I think it's because a lot of really famous artists happen to be white men.
Fair enough.
I mean, that's, it's something that I've thought about too. Like when, there are shows in like museums and large institutions who, these days are trying to diversify for sure. And some have, but when you look at collections and when you look at what shows are, major exhibitions, like right now, I think at the AGO, there was recently an Andy Warhol show, and there was a Monet show, and right now there's a Picasso show. So like, and they keep having these, presumably is because they draw in the crowds because they're famous artists and people know about them, and they'll say, oh, like I'll come see it, which I guess makes sense from a financial standpoint. But yeah, like I think it's possible that the creators of these plays are just like, well, we need somebody famous, like somebody who's like a household name and that everybody's heard of, and they just happen to be these few select individuals. So that's kind of the only thing I can think of at this point. And maybe somebody has made a play or musical about like, an artist like of, a different gender or culture or background that maybe just wasn't as successful, but I guess we just have to get better at discovering them if that's the case.
Yeah, I will say this is almost certainly not true for non-English shows, but I only speak English because
yeah.
So this is where I'm at. But but it's so true what you were talking about, and it is. I feel like I get on this every time, but it is a self-perpetuating cycle. It's like, oh, these artists are the most famous, and so we put on their shows to attract audiences, and we make musicals about their life because people are drawn to them and people have connections with them because they know their art. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that when you do that, you're just contributing to that cycle. And so it's hard though, because it's like, unless, Lin-Manuel Miranda makes a musical about, a female artist or a Black artist or whoever, then you're not going to get the kind of funding and attention that you need to get your show going. Theater is very expensive. So you go with Van Gogh, who you love anyway. And yeah, it just keeps going.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe let's keep an eye out on people who feature all kinds of different artists. I hope we'll see more of them in the future.
Yeah, everybody send me your indie shows about artists. I would love to see them and know about them. But this actually leads me to my very last question of the episode today. Who would you want to see? If you could pick any artist, and it can be a white man, it's fine if it is. But if you could pick any artist, whose art would you want to see on stage?
Not to say that people now have to make musicals about Asian women, but
they do.
Yeah, they should. The person that just kind of, I guess, immediately came to mind is Yayoi Kusama.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, and I made a YouTube video about her. Like, I love her. I think her work is great. But I think the other thing is, like, she just had she's still alive, so she still has, or she had, like, up until now, a pretty interesting life and still does. And she's like a really unique type of person. Like, she has like a really unique character, and she's also kind of gone through a lot of things in her life that are quite tragic as well. So I would say I feel like she would make a very interesting, or like her life story, or maybe just similar to Van Gogh, various points in her life could just make really interesting stories that's, connected to her art. And again, her art also lends itself well to these like really great visuals and backdrops as well. So yeah, let's somebody make a musical or play about Kusama, please.
That's such a great answer. Her work would be so cool on stage. And I just have to share that I just had the following thought process, because when I was thinking about, who would I want to see, I thought about Georgia O'Keeffe. And then I was like, how's there not a musical about Georgia O'Keeffe? And then I Googled it, and there is.
Oh, okay.
So I take back about 10% of what I previously said. Georgia O'Keeffe, as is always the token woman in the room when we talk about famous artists. But there was a musical that was made about Georgia O'Keeffe called Hello Sky, which is very nice. And so that exists, apparently. It was fully staged for the first time, it looks like, in 2010. And so I don't know if this is still in active development or not, but good for you, people who made a musical about Georgia O'Keeffe. And then my other answer I wanted to say was Basquiat, we did an episode about him previously, and he was a really amazing artist and a fascinating person. And also was good friends with Keith Haring. So maybe bring back the Keith Haring musical, make a Basquiat musical, do them in repertory. I'm just spitballing here.
Yeah, you can even have like a crossover between the Keith Haring and the Basquiat musical,
Well, thank you to Mark Platt and everyone else who's listening to this episode of Pictorial. You can find our show notes at relay.fm/pictorial. And you can find us on Twitter or Instagram at PictorialPod. You can also find me on Instagram at AspiringRobotFM.
And you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at articulationsv, and I'm also on YouTube as Articulations. And speaking of YouTube, we also have a YouTube channel, Pictorial Podcast, where we upload visual versions of our podcasts, usually a few weeks after the audio version has come out. And for this episode, I guess we'll be looking at some pictures of musicals.
Thanks for listening, art enthusiasts.